Hi again, students. Welcome to week 3 of this summer class. So I'm going to be covering chapter 7. Chapter 7 is on consumers, producers, and market efficiency. So first things first, what is welfare? When you say the welfare of something, right? So in economics, welfare means how better off is the economic agent, right? So if you're dealing with consumers, aka households and individuals that buy stuff in the goods and services market, then welfare would be how much we are getting or benefiting from purchasing the goods that we buy. So for instance, when are consumers most happy, most satisfied? Whenever we get discounts, right? So whenever we're able to buy things at a cheaper price, then consumers are most satisfied and have a better welfare in general, right? So that's welfare for consumers is called consumer surplus. Okay, so we're going to be starting off with consumer surplus. And basically, this is your willingness to pay minus your equilibrium price. I'm going to call that EP. So what is willingness to pay? Willingness to pay means how much do you value a product, right? So for instance, you go to a restaurant, right? You're hungry, you want to buy some burger and some fries, right? How much do you value that food at that point in time? So probably your value is for $10, right? And then the price that you're selling it there is $13, right? You're not going to be willing to buy that product because your willingness to pay is lower than the price that you're selling it, right? So the only way consumers are happy in the market is if their willingness to pay exceeds your equilibrium price, okay? So that's when consumers are happy and satisfied in the market. So let's put this in the graphical form. So you have your demand curve, right? Okay. And then this highest point on the demand curve is your willingness to pay, okay? And your equilibrium price, remember your equilibrium price is where your supply curve intersects with your demand curve, right? So let's assume that this is your supply curve. So your equilibrium price, let's just assume $15, right, is your equilibrium price. And let's even say you want to buy steak meat, right? So let's say steak meat. How much would you value some steak meat? So let's say you value it as high as $40, okay? But this is the equilibrium price. So you're willing to pay as much as $40 for that steak meat, but it only sells for $15, right? So of course you're very happy, you're very excited. You get to keep some extra money in your pocket, right? So that is your consumer surplus. So your consumer surplus is basically the difference between how much you're willing to pay, which is your value for the good, and how much you actually pay, right? Your selling price, right? And do you notice what shape this is? What shape does this make? This makes a triangle shape. And what is the formula for triangle? Area of a triangle is calculated as half base times height. So I'm going to take a few quick examples to illustrate how we actually do this. So remember that the lower the price, the higher your consumer surplus, because we want to save some money, and the higher the price, the lower your consumer surplus, right? So for instance, if there's a drought or famine in the land, and that makes the price of the goods go up, what that means is that your consumer surplus is going to go down because the good is more expensive. You're going to buy less of the good. Basically, you're spending more in the market because it's more expensive. So your consumer surplus for that good is going to go down. Okay, so now to a quick example. Assuming we have 4 buyers in the market. So let's just say buyers A, B, C, D, right? And then your willingness to pay at this amount here, right? But your equilibrium price, which is the same thing as your market price, remember your invisible hand, your equilibrium price and your market price is $110, right? Okay, so now how many of these consumers do you think are going to remain in this market? Based on what they are able to buy. So demand is based off on your willingness and your ability to buy. So it's not just about being willing. I mean, I want a Lamborghini, but can I afford it, right? Okay, so the market price is $110, but buyer D, let's say Daisy, is only willing to pay $100. So therefore, she can't afford to buy this good, right? So Daisy is automatically out of the market. But buyers A, B, and C all have a higher willingness to pay than the market price. So these 3 buyers are going to remain in the market. So now we know that 3 buyers are going to remain in the market. How do we calculate their consumer surplus? Remember what I said, your willingness to pay minus your equilibrium price. So for buyer A, he's willing to pay as much as $150. So $150 minus $110, that's going to give you $40. And then for buyer B, he's willing to pay as much as $135, and that's going to give you a difference of $15. No, $25. That's going to give you a difference of $25, right? So $135 minus $110, that's a difference of $25. How about buyer C? Buyer C is willing to pay as much as $120, so she's able to save $10 because the market price is only $110, right? So now the addition of all of this is going to give you the total consumer surplus in this market, right? So $40 plus $25, that's $65, plus $10, that gives you $75, right? Which is your total consumer surplus, okay? So that is a quick illustration of how you calculate consumer surplus. I'm going to give a more in-depth illustration, and this is based off on so this is how you calculate for a table, right? So in this table, you're only calculating based on how many consumers remain in the market. But in a graphical illustration, you're able to not just see how many people are in the market, you're able to see the quantity of goods that are being demanded, okay? All right, so now at $15, let's assume that 40 units of good are being demanded, right? This is the market price and this is the market quantity. Okay, but now the willingness to pay is as high as $40. So again, these are two different examples that I'm giving you. So you look at this shape. What shape is this? This is a triangle shape. And the difference between the willingness to pay and the equilibrium price is $25. Right? And then how much is being sold at this equilibrium price? 40 units, okay? So therefore, your consumer surplus in terms of calculation is going to be half. The base is how much quantity is sold. Half times 40. And then the height is going to be the difference in the price, the willingness to pay and the equilibrium price, so times 25, okay? So 20 times 25, that should give you about $500. I think my math is mathing. Okay, so that is how you calculate consumer surplus, okay, in a very simple illustration. Now, how about when there is an increase in price? So when there's an increase in price, or actually we could even let's go with a decrease in price. We all love cheaper prices, so let's go with a decrease in price. So when price decreases, right? So let's say they're doing a sales and then the price goes all the way to $10. Now, you know, based on your law of demand, the quantity demanded is going to increase, right? So let's say it goes all this way and you have 50 units now being demanded at $10, okay? So this is your point A and this is your new point B. What is going to happen to the consumer surplus? The consumer surplus is definitely going to increase because the price is cheaper, right? But now, how much of that is based off on old sellers versus how much of that is based off on new sellers? So you know when they are doing promo or sales, you're going to have new people entering the market because the price is cheaper, right? And then you're still going to have the old buyers who are in the market. So this proportion, this rectangle shape, is going to be based off on the old buyers who were in the market originally, and then this shaded parts, this triangle shape, is going to be based off on the new buyers that are entering the market because of the cheaper price, okay? So let's calculate the new consumer surplus is going to be half. What is the base? So now you have 50 units being demanded. So that is your base. And then what is your height? So willingness to pay was as high as $40, but now it's $10. So 40 minus $10 is going to give you $30, right? Okay, so that is going to give you, all right, 25 times 30, 25 times 3, that should give you 75. So how much of this increase in consumer surplus is due to the old buyers? So that is going to be this rectangle proportion. And what is the area of a rectangle? The area of a rectangle is base times height, okay? So the difference in this, the base is still going to be 40 for this rectangle. So rectangle, area of a rectangle. So that's going to be 40 for the base, 40 units being demanded, times your height, which is the difference in the price, $15 minus $10, that is $5, okay? So this is $200 that is due to the old buyers in the market. Now, for the old buyers, okay? How about those that are due to the new buyers? So that is going to be, again, the area of a triangle, and which is half base times height. So this shaded portion is a small triangle, and the difference in the base is 50 units minus 40 units, right? So that is how much extra is being demanded as a result of the drop in price. So that is times 10 units. And then how about the height? The height is difference of $15 minus $10, so that is $5. So that is going to give you, so $25 is going to be due to the influx of new buyers, right? So therefore, your consumer surplus is going to increase by $200 from the old buyers who buy more products due to the price drop, and plus $25 for the new buyers who enter the market due to the price drop, okay? So your consumer surplus literally increases by $200 plus $25. $225, right? So that is how consumer surplus increases as a result of a decrease in price. So you always have to be sure of the shape, and then from there you calculate your consumer surplus, right? And if you notice, when we calculated the increase in consumer surplus using the whole triangle, there's an extra $25 missing, right? So it's meant to be $250 when you calculate the difference between this old consumer surplus and the new consumer surplus, right? It should be $250, but this is $225 is gained due to the buyers buying more, including like old buyers and new buyers buying more quantity of the good as a result of the price drop. The remaining $25 is absorbed in the market, right? Which is what the company benefits. Okay. So something else that I really want to emphasize is when you're talking about consumer surplus, it has to be directly related to the price of that good, right? So you know how we have substitute goods and complementary goods. The price of a related good would affect the quantity demanded or the demand of a related good, right? But it doesn't affect the consumer surplus of a related good. So if I'm looking at this marker, right, a change in the price of this marker would affect the consumer surplus of this marker. So if the price of this marker drops, then the consumer surplus of this paper towel may or may not increase or decrease, right? Regardless of the fact that these are complementary goods and these are used together, right? So for related goods, the consumer surplus of good X doesn't relate to the price of good Y, right? So it's directly the price of good Y that you are for sure affects the consumer surplus of good Y, right? So in this case, we're looking at apples, right? So the change in the price of apple is directly for sure going to affect the willingness to pay the consumer surplus of apple. It doesn't have anything to do with orange, which is a related good. It could be a substitute good or a complementary good, okay? So that's something I want to emphasize. So now we have this example on the board, and we have the willingness to pay of different consumers A, B, and C, right? And now let's assume we have a range of market price, okay? How do we calculate how much is going to be bought in this market? So we've done a similar example right here, but this example was just based on a fixed market price of $110. But now when you have a range of a market price from 25 cents to 75 cents, how do you calculate how much is going to be bought in the market? So notice how this is less than, it doesn't have equal to, it's just less than, right? So that means your actual price is ranging from 26 cents to 27 cents all the way to 74 cents. So do you understand that? Okay, so that is the actual market price that we're looking at. So now let's take consumer A, right? Consumer A is willing to pay as high as $2 for the first apple. $2 is definitely greater than the highest maximum price of 74 cents. So definitely consumer A is going to buy the first apple. How about the second apple? $1.5 willingness to pay is definitely greater than 74 cents actual market price. So she's going to buy the second apple as well. How about the third apple? 75 cents willingness to pay is definitely greater than 74 cents for the market price. So consumer A is going to buy a total of 3 apples. Okay, how about consumer B? Consumer B is willing to pay as much as $1.5, which is greater than 74 cents. So consumer B is going to buy the first apple. Consumer B's willingness to pay here for the second apple is $1, which is still more than 74 cents. So she's buying the second apple for sure. How about the willingness to pay at 60 cents? 60 cents is less than the highest maximum market price of 74 cents. So therefore, consumer B cannot afford to get the third apple. Consumer B is only going to get 2 apples. How about consumer C? Consumer C has 75 cents willingness to pay, which is 1 cent above the market price. So she's going to buy, right? So that is 1. Consumer C only buys 1 apple. So therefore, the total apples being demanded in this market is going to sum up to 6. All right, so how about the welfare of the firms, the companies who are the producers? That is known as producer surplus. And that is simply how much they benefit in the market, right? So how do they make their gains in the market? The selling price, which is also known as the equilibrium price. So remember, this is your supply curve. Your supply curve slopes upward, and then you have your demand curve, right? And then the intersection is what forms the equilibrium. Okay, so equilibrium price, equilibrium quantity, right? Okay, so the difference between the market selling price, which is your equilibrium price, and the cost of production, which is the lowest point of the supply curve, right? So I'm going to call this production cost. That gives you your producer surplus. So producer surplus is your equilibrium price, which is also your market price, minus the production cost. And that should give you your producer surplus, right? So therefore, your equilibrium price, your selling price has to be greater than your production cost in order for the producer to make a gain in the market. Okay, so now let's take a quick example. Again, what shape is this? This shape is also a triangle, right? So half base times height. So the same calculation applies to producer surplus. Let's take a hypothetical example. So let's say we have 5 sellers in the market, right? And the cost of production is like this, as high as $1,600 and as low as $800. Okay, but the market price is just $8,150, right? So now, what do you think of seller A? Do you think seller A is going to remain in this market? He's spending $1,600 to produce the good. There's no way he's going to sell for $8,150. That's a loss, right? So seller A is out of the market. How about seller B? Seller B is also out of the market because the cost of production is more than the market price. For seller C, the cost of production is $1,100, so he's willing to sell for $1,150, right? So seller C makes a surplus of $50. And how about seller D? Seller D only spends $900 to produce the good and sells for $1,150, right? So seller D is going to make a profit of $250. How about seller E? Seller E is going to make a profit of $350. So 1,150 minus 800, right? So that's $350. And the combination of everything is going to add up to $650, right? So this is your total producer surplus. This is your total producer surplus, $650, okay? So that is how you calculate producer surplus. So now to take a quick example using a graphical illustration, it's the same concept. You have the formula, so you take that. Okay, so now let's assume equilibrium price is $30, and then the equilibrium quantity is 50 units that are being sold, okay? So therefore, your producer surplus is going to be, your producer surplus is simply going to be half. What is your base? Your base is 50 units that are sold, times, what is your height? Your height is the difference between $30 and the cost of production. Let's assume that cost of production in this graph is just $5, right? So that means the gain is going to be $30 minus $5, which is $25, okay? So by the time you do your algebra, okay, so half times 50 units sold times $25, which is the difference between your market price and your cost of production. So half times 50 times 25, that's going to give you 25 times 25, which is $625 for your producer surplus, right? So now again, let us assume that the price changes. Let's assume that the price goes up because producers like higher prices, and if the price goes up, then the producer surplus is going to go up because they'll be willing to produce more and sell at a higher price. If the price goes down, then producer surplus is going to go down, okay? So now let's assume that the price goes up, right? Let's say the price goes up to $40, right? So you see that they're willing to supply this much goods, okay? All right, so let's say they're willing to supply as much as 65 units of this good, okay? So now, remember, initially you had the old producer surplus was half times 50 units times $25, which gives you 625, right? And now your new producer surplus is going to be, so remember, you want to know how much of this increase in producer surplus is due to old versus new sellers, okay? So I'm just going to take out the demand curve so that it's very easy to see what is going on. All right. Okay. So now you can see that the increase in this consumer surplus can be divided into two parts, right? So you have your rectangle parts and you have your shaded parts. And the rectangle part is due to the old sellers that were already in the market. And then the shaded part is due to the new sellers. Okay, so this is your new and this is your old. Okay, so now let's calculate. How much of this increase in producer surplus is due to the old? So what shape is this? It's a rectangle. So the difference in the price, let's start with the base. Base times height is the area of a rectangle. So area of rectangle. Okay, base times height, how much is sold? So at this you have 50 units being sold. And then how much quantity? How much is the increase in the price? $10. $40 minus $30. So that's $10. Okay, so that's going to give you $500. And then how about, and this $500 is due to the old sellers, okay? And then how much of this area, how much of the increase in producer surplus is due to the new sellers, right? So that would be the area of a triangle, half base times height. So this is your base and this is your height. For this, half base times height. Okay, so half times, which one is your base? So you look at this shape of the triangle, 65 minus 50 units, that gives you 15 units, okay? And then how about the difference in the height? The difference in the height, $40 minus $30, that gives you $10. So 2 divided here, 15 times $5 multiplied times half. So that's going to give you $75, which is due to the new sellers. So the increase in the price, which led to the increase in the producer surplus, is going to give $500 producer surplus for the old sellers, plus $75 extra producer surplus for the new sellers, okay? So that's a total of $575 extra producer surplus, okay? In addition to the $625 that was in the market already. And of course, the rest is what the market gains. Okay, so let's say you have a question that asks you to find the market price, which is the equilibrium price, right? So basically, you know that your producer surplus is the difference between your market price and your production cost. So if you have a question that asks you to find the market price, all you need to do is simple algebra, bring production cost to the other side. So equilibrium price or market price is going to be equal to your producer surplus plus your production cost, right? Okay. And the same thing applies for willingness to pay.